Şimdi eşitsizliklerin azaltılması hedefinden bahsedildi. Tam da bu perspektiften aslında UNDP'den aramızda bir misafirimiz var. Sürdürülebilir Kalkınma Departmanı'nın takım lideri George Baum bizlerle birlikte. Ve bugün eşitsizliklerin azaltılması kapsamı nedir ve bu kapsamda hangi gruplara ne gibi desteklerin verilmesi ya da bu alanda hangi yapılar yer alıyor, nasıl destekler sağlıyor? Birazcık onlardan bahsedecek, konuşmasını yapacak. George'u sahneye davet etmek isterim.
Thank you.
Eğer çevirme ihtiyacınız varsa da hemen şurada yer alıyor. Bu konuşma İngilizce olacak.
Thank you. And really, çok teşekkürler. I mean, it's a pleasure for me to be here, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I really enjoyed the passionate intervention from the previous speaker about inequality, and I'm going to try and talk a little bit about inequality today because it really is one of the fundamental challenges facing humankind at the current moment. It really has, I think, in the past come up and hit us in the back of the head, and since the global financial crisis, I think the situation has worsened quite a bit. And I think there's also a need to unpack a little bit what inequalities is, because it is a very complex term. We talk about, and the preface, what the previous speaker said about SDGs, one of the key principles of the SDGs is the principle of leaving no one behind. And it's basically a concept that says if we address those who are furthest left behind first, we can resolve the problems of sustainable development. And I think that this is really the grand challenge for the world in current times. And really in the past, governments have not really wanted to enter into the discussion of inequalities very much. They haven't wanted to reveal what is the status of inequalities because it comes with a very political connotation to it as well. It's often seen as a political issue that governments are perhaps not doing enough. And even in UNDP, when we publish our annual Human Development Report, we will often get countries telling us that they don't agree with where they are ranked in the Human Development Index. And these are the kind of political issues that you get when you talk about sensitive issues such as inequalities. But when we've talked about inequalities in the past, we've talked about income measures and basically outcomes. These are measures of inequality outcomes. And one of the key measures to do this has been, sorry, I should be doing my presentation here. One of the key measures of doing this has been using the Gini coefficient. And what you'll see from this slide is that in many of the former Soviet countries, inequalities using this measurement are not as bad as some of the more developed countries in the world, such as the UK, USA, and even China, has higher inequality measures using the Gini coefficient as opposed to some of the former Soviet countries here. But the problem with this measure is that it often ignores a lot of the people at the top of the income scale. This data is often missing. So there's been a lot of effort now to look at national income as another means of measuring inequality. And this is some recent research that has been done looking at the situation in Europe. And basically, as the previous speaker said, the gap between who's at the top and who is at the bottom is going like this. And basically, you see here, this slide is showing the top 10% of earners across Europe in 4 different regions. And you see, since 1980, the graph is going up. If I put another graph next to this, which showed the bottom 50%, it would show the lines going down. And so the gap is widening between top and bottom from an income perspective. However, in Europe, it's not as bad as the US, and whether that's any comfort for anyone, I'm not sure. And I imagine that the situation in Turkey would be somewhat similar, where you have this kind of widening of the gap like this. I don't have any data, I'm sorry, I wished I'd kind of looked into it a little bit more. But I would argue that this is not a measure of human condition. This is a measure of what people receive from economic development, which is fundamentally different to what is the opportunity, the inequality of opportunities for people to take themselves out of poverty or to improve their lives generally. And there's a piece of text which kind of goes something along the lines of that, you know, people who are in absolute poverty, they lack both the means and the opportunities to change their status. They lack what we call positive liberty. So they're actually constrained from actually developing their own human potential. And this increasingly is seen as an intergenerational issue. So we are not dealing with a short period of time, we are dealing generational issues. And if we add on top of this the consequences of climate change and environmental degradation, these gaps are only going to increase. And we're going to find that people are increasingly, from generation to generation, stuck in the same trap that they've always been in. And I think, you know, in the age of sustainable development, we really need to talk about these variable issues that affect the inequality of opportunities. And this is why, you know, we see that there is increasing, I think, movement or disillusionment with democratic systems. And I think what we're seeing is that there is a perception that inequalities are actually increasing quite significantly. And here's some research that was done that show that for these countries here, most of them are countries that we work a lot with, the perceptions on socio-political inequalities is really quite high. It's around 50% in some countries and even higher, where people believe that governments are being run increasingly by a few vested interests. And this is creating a lack of economic opportunity for the public at large, and they feel helpless to be able to address their own situation. I was watching CNN last night, and they've done a similar survey in the UK, and it was similar results. So this is a trend that's happening, I think, everywhere. So for the second part of my presentation, I want to talk a little bit about the SDGs now, and a little bit about this principle of leaving no one behind. And if you think about leaving no one behind, yeah, it makes sense. We kind of presume that, you know, if we find somebody who's not doing so well, we can help them. Yeah, we understand that. But what does it mean from a kind of structural society perspective? And we've been trying to do some work in terms of look at the various perspectives that would qualify for someone being left behind. And we see that we probably can class it under 5 different particular issues. And these are overlapping issues in many contexts. But what it actually means is that if we can identify these factors and address them in some way, then we can actually do something about addressing inequality. But it requires quite a complex policy response, and it requires a multiple stakeholder response. Increasingly, this is not an issue about governments alone. Increasingly, this is also an issue for the private sector, and that's why I'm very pleased to be with you here today, because we now recognise the role that, you know, private sector and entrepreneurs and other actors in society have a role to play around addressing these issues. So whilst we might want to use the SDGs as a global framework to define this, inequality is an issue about national and local communities, because they are the ones suffering from this problem. And it's less about sustainable development than it is about what people are actually going through in this point of time. And that's why it needs stakeholder groups such as this to be able to address the problem at local scales. However, what the SDGs do provide for us, they provide us with a framework to be able to measure these. And this is the biggest benefit that we now have with the SDGs, that it creates a forum where we can actually discuss what are some of the trends and what are some of the issues. And if we look at discrimination alone, we can look at a number of SDG targets that we can use to measure it and define the boundaries of the issue. We've not had this before in the development context, which now gives us an opportunity to hold governments to account a little bit more effectively, but be able to, more importantly, have debates and to be able to present these issues, whereas in the past we were probably more limited. So for us in the development field, I think it's very important that we look to take this issue in its kind of extent, because I think that there are many issues around this problem where we're talking about refugees, we're talking about people with disabilities. There are many facets to those problems which need to be addressed to bring these people out of poverty, or to reduce their levels of inequality. So in the last part of my presentation, I want to talk a little bit about some of the opportunities and constraints. And here I hope I'll get to some examples that you might find interesting. We, in UNDP, we work a lot with governments, but increasingly we see that governments are constrained to address this issue at scale. We see that there is a need for safety nets, for welfare systems, but yet these welfare systems are not well designed, and they are not reaching the full extent of the population. In some countries, only 1 in 5 people who need welfare are receiving welfare. And increasingly, governments are being constrained by fiscal space. What does that mean? They don't have the money to put into the welfare system for the welfare system to meet the needs of the society. And so this is a problem where we find that governments increasingly, where populations are aging, more money is needed for older people, but then how do we then support people who are unemployed or refugees or migrants who need the support also? But the problem with redistribution is that it can de-incentivize people to be involved in productive sectors. And this is why looking to the private sector, how they can become involved in these activities, is much more productive from an economic perspective than it is from a social welfare perspective. And we're doing a lot of work now where we're trying to bring together employment policy and social welfare policy so people don't end up on welfare streams for years and years and years and end, because let's face it, it's a human condition. We want to be productive. We want to be contributing. So the private sector has a role to play, and there's probably from 2 perspectives. It's both inclusive finance and also inclusive business practices. And I'll define a little bit what I mean about those two particular issues. And then I'll give you some examples. In Turkey here alone, we've been working with over 50 successful partnerships, not me personally, but through our country office in Ankara. We've been doing a lot of work around these particular issues. So the first one I want to talk about is financial inclusion. And generally, around the world, there are about 1.6 billion people who are excluded from having bank accounts or do not have bank accounts at the moment. If we brought all those people into the financial system, it would be a tremendous boost to the global economy. But the problem is they lack financial literacy, they lack access to technology, they lack access to the services that they need. But with technology now, it's much easier to find these people and give them access to mobile phones, for example. Everyone's got a mobile phone. And financial technology is going on in leaps and bounds. But this needs people to be trained in financial literacy. And there's been some work going on with Visa here in Turkey to train volunteers on financial awareness, on financial well-being, and providing trainings on financial management. The second area is maybe perhaps a little bit more interesting for you, but it's the inclusive business practices. And this is basically where we move beyond the idea that we just create employment and we find someone on the labour market and they come and work for us. Where we actually have positive practices, where we look for people who might need that support. They might be a little bit less included in society. They might be subject to some of these barriers that I talked about earlier. And so how do we find them? How do we bring them into an employment practice? They need to be trained, they need to have certain skills, and this is an area that we are increasingly working with the private sector to do, but increasingly with governments to ease the reforms on ministries of labour, public employment services, to be able to identify, to reach out to those people, identify them, train them, and then find jobs for them. So this is very much the multi-stakeholder practice that I worked about. And two examples I'll mention quickly. The first one is we've been focusing a lot on gender issues because I think really, giving women empowerment and ensuring that we have equality between genders is really the key to sustainable development. And there's been a lot of work around trying to do positive practices to get women into the labour market. Women's participation suffers because of a lack of education, and there's this project which has been trying to focus on engineering. The last one I will mention is on the refugees, where we've been working with the government and some private companies to set up these private sector training centres. Basically look at digitalisation issues, looking at how we can build productivity, looking at how we can train them to undertake key activities within the private sector, and giving them new skills, particularly so they can be here in Turkey and add productively. So that is my presentation. Thank you very much. I really want to say that I think the key really is within the private sector to help address a lot of these issues, because there's a lot of financing opportunities and a lot of opportunities to change the way we work and the way we think about inequalities. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you very much.